Ah, now this one must be very profound. The Ethics of Aristotle. Now, anybody that read that must believe he's a cut above anybody that hadn't. See, it's no good, Montag. We've all got to be alike. The only way to be happy is for everyone to be made equal. So, we must burn the books, Montag.
We want to be free. We want to be free to do what we want to do. We want to be free to ride. We want to be free to ride our machines without being hassled by the man. And we want to get loaded.
Believe me, if I started murdering people, there'd be none of it left. Because my children are telling me. I told you 20 years ago.
It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
In my way of thinking, without judgment, you might as well be dead. Your brain is, so why not the rest of you? We were talking about marijuana. We still are. Marijuana is the flame, heroin is the fuse, LSD is the bomb. So don't you try to equate liquor with marijuana, mister, not with me.
All right, welcome to Pop Your Culture, everybody. I'm your host, Randall LeBron, and on this week's journey through points of pop culture here in our Western culture, well, we have two interesting figures that are going to be under our watchful gaze this time around, and I have to say, just straight up, this is one of those shows where the rabbit hole is nearly bottomless. As I was reading into these two figures, I realized that this is going to be the first of multiple shows, and I'm not talking in succession, but we are by no means done with Wernher von Braun nor Jack Parsons by the time we make it through to the other side of this 2-hour experience, because these guys, well, they stomped the Terra, to borrow a phrase from Hunter S. Thompson. These guys, fathers of modern rocket science, in very many ways. It may strike all of you out there as a really weird choice for a show like this. How do these guys work into it? Well, my interests are pretty wide-reaching, at times quite esoteric, and I think maybe one of the things that is coming out as we work through these shows is I definitely have a pretty heavy interest in the occult. It's fascinating to me. It always has been, and it most likely always will be. Now, this show has been a great way for me to indulge certain aspects of that, because in reading about those schools of thought, those disciplines, occasionally interesting characters come up, and characters that make me go, I need to know more about you. Jack Parsons is one of those figures. It is said in some of the readings and other podcasts and everything like that that I was listening to in this past week, for a while, and this is pretty open public record, he was essentially studying in the same occult schools as Alice Crowley, was maybe even going to be considered to be tapped upon to maybe fill some of those larger roles in organizations like the OTO. Pretty weird when you consider that heavy into the occult, and he was one of the guys who designed the first solid rocket fuel. And self-taught at that. Really kind of interesting. Died in very suspicious circumstances. But before we really take the time to dive into some of the controversy and some of the achievements around Jack Parsons, we're going to start the show off with Wernher von Braun, who he's basically the guy who helped kick open NASA And I know that at this point in time, not everybody's necessarily a big fan of NASA, but whatever. That's maybe fodder for another show. Because trust me, there are more rabbit holes there. There are many rabbit holes that are linked, and some run parallel, and occasionally maybe rub closely enough together that you pick up something by osmosis. But Wernher von Braun is an interesting character in North American history, and predominantly American history, because he was at one time a Nazi scientist. That is matter of public record. He was brought into the U.S. under the operation known as Paperclip. It was in post-World War II sort of stratagems that the Americans sought to bring over as many Nazi scientists as they possibly could to work in American industry, because it was either they take these scientists or the USSR was going to take the scientists. There was a race in both countries to pull as much of the brain trust out of post-World War II Germany as they could. And there was a lot of instances where they maybe had to look the other way in terms of some of the stuff that these guys were responsible for. Now, despite the fact that he was very closely associated with the Nazi Party, like a member of the SS, von Braun didn't necessarily look upon the activities of those parties as something that he worked towards, that he emulated, or anything like that. And it almost seems weird. It's not that I'm trying to be, a Nazi apologist. It's just that this individual was and I don't necessarily mean this in a negative way, an opportunist. He needed to join these parties and pay his political dues to said organizations in order to stay devoted to the true silver thread of his life, and that was working on rocket science. He was a guy who wanted to go to the moon. To that extent, he helped develop the Saturn V rocket, which took Americans to the moon in July 1969. There are conspiracy theories around that, which, yes, we will have to take a look at in other shows. We're not going to go down those particular paths in this one. But before he got to the Saturn V rocket, he also developed something called the V2 rocket. Now, that was the particular rocket that was used to basically rain death upon the UK during World War II. Germany would fire these rockets. So like the bombing of London, it would be V2s going over there. This was such a legendary rocket that it inspired the first song that we're going to get into tonight by way of David Bowie and the album Heroes. This is V2 Schneider on Popular Culture on Radio Gordo and Cheer FM. Wernher von Braun was an interesting man. The aforementioned V2 rocket was one of the first artificial, or actually the first artificial rocket to have been shot into space, or essentially artificial object. Said to have achieved that on the 20th of June in 1944, and as that was still occurring during, actual Nazi regime in Germany, these accomplishments were some of the things that actually had him noted by Americans who wanted to get him out of Germany in post-war operations. Now, he was the Operation Paperclip was an operation undertaken by the Americans, and these usually happened in secret. It is said that approximately 1,600 German scientists, technicians, engineers were taken out of Germany and brought to the American soil. Now, with von Braun, he had a really interesting sort of way of gathering or gaining experience within the American industrial complex. In the 50s, he actually worked with Walt Disney and helped produce a set of films which popularized the idea of human space travel. And this took place sort of in the mid-late 50s. In a little bit, we're going to actually get into a segment of that, just because I thought it was too interesting to pass up. And then it was by 1960 that the group that he was working with ended up being brought into NASA, and from there he was essentially the director. It's pretty interesting. It was the Saturn V rocket that it was like this rocket that was a heavy enough lift, so basically it could bring in enough thrust and fuel to lift everything up there and actually get people to the moon. Now, he was the chief architect of that, so it's pretty wild that he managed to bring that history into it. Now, von Braun also he was an advocate of something that is actually quite contemporary. Even back then, and he died in 1977, and back in the 60s, he was already talking about humans traveling to Mars. It was a goal for him. He really liked the idea of us getting to the technological point where we could lift off of this great, just imaginatively life-bearing rock floating through this massive vacuum of space, and the idea of going to these distant planets. For a guy who was part of the SS, it seems almost weird. And now, I guess to really contextualize it, there was a quote that I heard that was attributed to him, that he essentially referred to Hitler as a small little man with a Napoleon complex and a Charlie Chaplin mustache. I mean, the guy was smack-talking his boss, and who was, by all accounts, a pretty vicious little guy. So, I mean, personally speaking, that almost is enough to score a few points for von Braun. We'll talk a little bit more about him after this next set of songs. It seems fitting to get rather technological. Blue Tech is standing by, but first up, this is Boom Slang with Dr. Spaceman.
Now, for the procedure, you can choose between local or general anesthesia. I should warn you that general anesthesia can cause powerful hallucinations. So, I highly recommend it. simply working on a pill that keeps people awake under any circumstances.
But does it work?
It's got my lab rats awake for days. But we're looking for human subjects.
Where do I sign up?
Now, they may not technically mean space, but for our intents and purposes in this show, blue tech holding space fits with the theme. I'm Randall LeBron. This is Popular Culture on Cheer FM and Radio Gordo. This is the Wernher von Braun and Jack Parsons episode. Right now, we're still talking about von Braun. Now, in his youth, his father worked for the government, and von Braun, he had a big interest in music composition. He actually kind of fancied chasing down a career that way. It is said that he could play piano pieces of Beethoven and Bach entirely from memory, which is pretty amazing. As his schooling progressed, he ended up developing an interest in physics and mathematics, and that was mainly to be able to further his ideas of wanting to work in space travel. There was a program that called Opel Rack, and it was run by a fellow named Fritz von Opel and Max Waller. It was said that it was going in the late 1920s and it went into the 30s. Now, these guys were developing rocket-powered cars and rocket-powered planes, so really precursors to the whole burgeoning space travel kind of program. Now, when he was young, and we're talking, teenager, I guess he's about 16, von Braun is said to have actually built his own rocket-powered vehicle, which ended in an accident that basically caused a detonation of it. It blew up in the street. Von Braun was arrested, and he nearly killed himself in the bargain, but it still didn't actually, pull down his dreams of wanting to go forward with space exploration. And so once the Great Depression hit, I mean, we're talking like a big Western world effect right there, he had to look to different ways to pursue everything. So after attending school, he joined the Space Flight Society. And it was through all of that, graduating, that he wanted to pursue more of his career in basically the physics of space travel. And all of that led to the point of, once the Nazi regime came to power in the 1930s and was essentially trying to restore the power and glory of Germany after World War I, it was something that von Braun could accept as kind of a necessary evil to pursue his work a little bit more. I think, and this is weird, I think I can understand it, and maybe this is, perhaps it's a weird parallel, but maybe, just maybe, we can look at von Braun's involvement with the Nazi regime power structure, which enabled him to just continue to do his work so long as he joined the clubs and didn't necessarily perform the evils of the clubs. I mean, the awkward parallel that I'm going to draw here is what was going on with the pandemic and things like masking and vaccine requirements. I'm not going to necessarily make a value judgment on either of those, but I know that there are a lot of people who feel that maybe they were forced or coerced into doing things that they didn't want to do in order to keep their jobs. Given what we've all experienced in the last couple of years, I guess I can understand that mindset. He just wanted to continue making rocket ships. I can understand doing what is necessary to keep your job. It is said that he said in interviews where he never really witnessed any of the brutal mistreatment or violence put upon any of the essentially slave labor that he had working in any of his factories during the war. He said, yes, they were still slave laborers, but he didn't see brutal mistreatment, and he threw shade at his boss. So I guess we got to appreciate that. Next up on the show, we got Harry Nilsson's Spaceman, but this is the Kinks' supersonic rocket ship.
Let me take you on a little trip. My supersonic ship's at your disposal if you feel so inclined. Well, alright. we're gonna travel faster than light, so drop your overcoat tight and we'll go anywhere you want to decide. Well, alright. Supersonic rocket ship, nobody has to be helped, nobody needs to be out of sight. Oh, out of sight, man. Nobody's gonna travel second class, there'll be equality and no suppression of minorities. We'll take this planet, supersonic ships at your disposal if you feel so inclined. Alright. Nobody gonna travel second class, there'll be equality and no suppression of minorities. Alright. Let me take you on a little trip. Supersonic rocket ship.
Bang, bang, shoot 'em up, destiny. Bang, bang, shoot 'em up to the moon. Bang, bang, shoot 'em up, 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3, 4. I wanted to be a spaceman, that's what I wanted to be. But now that I am a spaceman, nobody cares about me. Hey, Mother Earth, would you bring me back down safely to the sea? Around and around and around and around is all she ever said to me. To make a good run, I wanted to go to the moon. I knew that it had to be fun. I told him to send me real soon. I wanted to be a spaceman, I wanted to be it so bad. But now that I am a spaceman, I'd rather be back on the pad. Hey, Mother Earth, would you bring me back down safely to the sea? Around and around and around and around is just a lot of lunacy. Round and around and around and around and around. So bring me back down. Round and around and around and around and around. Safe on the ground. try to act so tall? Is this the reason? Deep in our mind. It does not feel, it does not die. Space is neither truth nor light. Into the void we have to travel to find the clue which will unravel. Is this the reason? Deep in our mind. The secret lies without tomorrow. In each of us is a hidden sorrow. What goes onwards through the night, beyond the realms of ancient night. Is this the reason? Deep in our
from Hawkwind. That was Space is Deep. Lemmy Kilmister, future founder of Motorhead, was in Hawkwind. Neat little bit that I always like to think about, considering Hawkwind was a massive drug-taking band. They kicked Lemmy out for doing drugs. It was just that he was doing the wrong kind. He liked speed, they liked acid, so they had to part ways. Before that, we had Harry Nilsson's Spaceman, the Kinks' Supersonic Rocket Ship before that. And continuing on with a little bit of a chat about Wernher von Braun, I looked up the actual quotes just to contextualize what he sort of said about his boss. One of the quotes is, "To us, Hitler was still only a pompous fool with a Charlie Chaplin mustache." So there's the Charlie Chaplin remark. And then that he perceived him, as Hitler, as another Napoleon who was wholly without scruples, a godless man who thought himself the only god. So, yeah, maybe this guy isn't necessarily one who's going to be doing the salutes joyously, but rather dutifully, in order to maintain his ability to continue to, well, build rocket ships. It's a pretty... As I said earlier, it's a pretty straight through line right there. He worked tirelessly for a lot of years in order to keep on doing that. And I suppose it's worth noting as well that, in some of the research that I did do, I did come across the fact that von Braun was actually arrested by the SS for essentially not working hard enough. He and a few of his fellow colleagues had what was described as a defeatist attitude towards the German war effort, upset that they were essentially having to work on the V2 rocket instead of spaceships. And that was, I think, again, one of those interesting things that despite maybe what he was doing, makes him a worthwhile character to at least have some respect for in the world of space and space travel. And I mean, in this contemporary age of talking about SpaceX, to name, for us anyways, one of the most popularly known private space groups, there are said to be, when I was looking at some of the figures last night, said to be thousands of startup companies and venture capitalists who are looking to get us into space. And von Braun, he was just one of the first guys to do a lot of that kind of stuff. He, under NASA, as I said earlier, he started working on something like that was called the Saturn V rocket, which was the thing that got man to the moon. The guy managed to stay so focused on his primary goal that he will forever be known in the world of space travel as one of those founding fathers. He had a really interesting life, and I think that is something that, like I said, we could definitely do a deeper dive into it. Maybe we we'll get to that sooner rather than later, although I do have ideas for shows next week. But be it as it may, he was one heck of a rocket scientist and indelibly left his mark on the 20th century. This is RJD2 with Rocket Science, right here on Pop Your Culture on Radio Gordo and Cheer FM.
Broadcast on September 13th, track 1. Broadcast on September 12th, track 2.
the engineer, spaceflight poses two problems. The first is, of course, to build a rocket ship. The second, and no less important, is to prepare and train the men who are to fly the future rocket ships and to provide suitable working conditions that will enable them to survive in space. To help show you what is being done to solve these problems, we have called upon one of the foremost exponents of space travel, Dr. Wernher von Braun, who is at present the chief of the Guided Missile Division of the Army's Rocket Center at Redstone Arsenal. He was also overall director of the development of the original V-2 rocket.
Now here's a model of my design for a four-stage orbital rocket ship. Compared to the unmanned instrument rocket, it is quite large, but the overall size and weight of the rocket is mainly determined by the 11 tons weight of this top section. This weight dictates the amount of fuel and the numbers of motors needed to produce enough power to equalize the gravitational pull of the Earth. The payload in the top section will consist of 10 crew members plus equipment. Notice the wings, small rocket motor, and landing gears. This is a section that must ultimately return the men to the Earth safely. To produce the energy needed to hurl this stage into the orbit, we need these three additional rocket-powered sections. Here we have a cutaway drawing of our rocket showing the location of the fuel and the motors of each section. The first stage carries 1,060 tons of fuel, and its 29 motors will lift the entire weight of the ship vertically off the ground. The second stage has 8 motors and carries 155 tons of fuel. It will be dropped when its speed has reached 14,300 miles per hour. The next is our third stage, with only 1 rocket motor and 13 tons of fuel. The third stage gives the passenger section the final kick to attain the orbit. It will not be separated from the passenger section until just before the return flight. The third stage will be left in space, and a very small motor in the winged fourth stage will return the ship to the atmosphere so it can glide back to the base. If we were to start today on an organized and well-supported space program, I believe a practical passenger rocket could be built and tested within 10 years. Of course, it would be foolish to rush headlong into building a 4-stage rocket, man it with a crew, and attempt to fire it into an orbit without first following a step-by-step research and development program. Let's illustrate this with the help of a few pictures. First, we would design and build the 4th stage, and then tow it into the air to test it as a glider. This would also allow the crews to practice. Next, low-altitude flights would be made, firing the small rocket motor in the 4th stage. This would also give the crew more and more training. Following that, the 3rd and 2nd stages would be constructed and tested very thoroughly on the ground, after which they would be joined to the passenger section so that faster and longer flights could be made up to speeds of about 12,000 miles per hour. The only thing remaining would be the building and ground testing of the huge 1st stage. Then there would be no more test flights. When all the sections are joined together, the ship and its crew will be ready for man's first flight in space.
That was an interesting little piece of recording right there, dating from 1955. That was von Braun himself speaking for a Disney science video. I looked, and maybe I didn't scour as hard as I could, but I couldn't find any actual recordings of Jack Parsons, the next figure that we're going to be examining in this sort of Fathers of Modern Rocket Science episode of Popular Culture. Weird, right? Where does this show go? Sometimes it's hard to say. As I say when I sign off, it's one of those things where, who knows where it's going to go? Let's see where my interest takes me this week, and I'll be honest about it. It was kind of backdoored in because of the occult connections that Jack Parsons had. Now, this is was one far out dude. For the 37 years that he spent on this planet, he racked up quite a cover sheet, as it were, for things that he was involved in with and the people that he was doing those weird things with. Because Jack Parsons, born Marvel Whiteside Parsons in 1914, he came from a broken home. His father, I guess, as I said, he visited prostitutes. It caused a split between Parsons' mother and father. He lived with his mother, was raised in a fairly wealthy family, and he wasn't necessarily the best student, but he was a curious little fellow, and he really took a liking to space. As a teenager, he had... And this is one of those things where I was this week years old when I learned that Jack Parsons actually had many hours worth of phone conversations with Wernher von Braun when Parsons was a teenager. It's pretty wild. It was when Parsons was part of his rocket groups, and he would have these connections with von Braun, and it was really interesting to learn that these two figures actually had some form of communication. It just seemed pretty wild. Whoa, fellow travelers. Whoa. Just so everybody knows, I do pre-record this show. I just saw a flash of lightning out in the sky. Kind of took me by surprise. I am recording this on Thursday evening. It's one of those things. Talking about Jack Parsons and the wildness there, and to have a flash of lightning in the sky seems rather interesting, especially when we start to talk about things like this guy was heavily involved. Ooh, there's the thunder. Heavily involved in occult work. Now, before he got into the occult, I guess what we could look at is he had a fascination with science fiction literature and rocketry when he was a kid. He is said to have began his amateur rocket experiments around 1928 with his school-aged friend Edward S. Foreman. They actually created a Latin phrase, ad aspera astrata, I believe is what it was. Ad aspera per astrata. And what it was is it was basically through hard work, the stars. It's not an exact translation, but that was the idea. Like, if they worked hard, they would be able to reach the stars. Despite the fact that, like Von Braun, that was just another flash of lightning. Pretty cool. I'm taking this as a sign that we're definitely on the right track with doing this show. Maybe we'll have a power outage and I'll have to finish recording this another time. Who knows? But anyways, so like what happened to Von Braun, they had the Great Depression roll along, kind of threw things off just a little bit, but Parsons still managed to be involved in all kinds of organizations. In the late 30s, said that he had a flirting with Marxism. That was before he ended up converting to Thelema, which was founded by Aleister Crowley. This guy, as I said, led a really weird and wild life. We're going to get into that a little bit more, but let's do some music. These guys, one of my all-time favorite bands, and because it feels like we're getting into something a little bit weird, this is something familiar done a little bit weird. This is Pucifer and Rocket Man.
Just my job 5 days a week. A rocket man, a rocket man. Oh, and I think it's gonna be a long, long time. Touchdown brings me round again to find I'm not the man that think I am at all.
That was the Claypool-Lennon delirium. That's Les Claypool of Primus, Sean Lennon of John Lennon lineage, Blood and Rockets Movement 1, saga of Jack Parsons. Jack Parsons sort of being the figure that we're going to be exploring a little bit more. Jack Parsons, who founded Jet Propulsion Laboratory, helped create one of the first solid rocket fuels based on experiments going back to being a teenager, in which they would use things like glue to bind together powder, like basically the fireworks. That was what they were using for propulsion in some of their early experiments. Then started using other things like aluminum foil and gunpowder to really sort of create solid forms of these fuels. Ooh, there's some more thunder. It's been happening while I've been recording this show. Pretty wild. The phrase that Parsons and his partner created was, now I'm getting it right, per aspera ad astra, or per aspera ad astra. Basically, through difficulty, through hardship, to the stars. Parsons, he started to actually get into the occult around this time. It is said that as a teenager, he performed a ritual that was supposed to invoke the devil into his bedroom. And he was worried that the invocation was actually successful and kind of frightened off of the occult path for a while. It was then that things started to change for the family. So we're looking at about 1928 going into 1929. In 1929, young Parsons got to travel with his family through Europe for a while. They returned to the United States essentially in time for the Great Depression to hit. And despite that happening, he managed to study at the privately run university school. It is said to have been a liberal institution with an unconventional approach to teaching. And he said that finally he flourished academically and he became the editor of the school newspaper. So that's pretty wild. He became interested in what was going on at Caltech, so the California Institute of Technology. He never really made it into a lot of these things. It's interesting. It was through his own, and I guess this is almost like an occult aspect of it, through his own sheer will that he managed to keep going with this. And it is said that in this period of time when he was working with friends who were going to Caltech and sort of being around all that, that was around when he first developed his solid rocket fuel, would have the phone conversation with von Braun. And as all of this kind of happened, if we want to fast forward, because the story gets a whole heck of a lot weirder, once he was involved with, once he got married, him and his wife joined the Order Tempus Orientis, which was the OTO, and that was Aleister Crowley's organization of Thelema. And it was through that Parsons, who was said to have been bisexual, had an open marriage with his first wife, had many basically ritualistic experiences with sex magic, in which he was working on a lot of esoteric pursuits, let's say. And it was during this phase of his life that he befriended a pre-Scientology L. Ron Hubbard. Yes, Lafayette Ron Hubbard was a friend of Jack Parsons. They would do these bizarre rituals together. It is also said that at one point, and I mean, you know, maybe does this color our view of Scientology, when a guy named Ron, who helped create it, wanted to start a business with Parsons, and Parsons threw in approximately $20,000 of his money around that time. Apparently that's what he had saved up. I mean, this is a guy who at one time was broke enough that he used to make nitroglycerin in the family home in order to support himself. Pretty bold, but it is said that he lent the money to Hubbard, who put in approximately $1,000 of his own money in this scheme to sell sailing ships bought in Florida in California, but not first before sailing around the world. Now, at this point, too, it is said that Hubbard had taken Parsons' love interest, who was the sister of his wife, because, you know, open marriage, the sex magic and all that kind of stuff, things were getting weird. When Parsons found out what Hubbard was doing, it said that Parsons performed a ritual in which he sought to influence the weather. It said that the weather kicked up so bad that Hubbard never actually made it out on that voyage. I mean, of course, nothing too ill fell upon Hubbard as he went on to do Scientology, but many people noted that there is a weird power to the actions of Parsons. Next up, we're going to do a couple more covers. Pucifer's cover of the Elton John track Rocket Man kind of opened up the door for this. Being that we're talking about darker and more nefarious energies, maybe Ministry falls into that category. They're going to cover Deep Purple. But before we get into that one, this band Behemoth is well known as being a very left-hand path metal band, and they're covering David Bowie. From Behemoth, this is Hello, Space Boy.
Bye, bye, fucking space boy.
Ministry with their cover of Deep Purple's Space Truck and fitting follow-up to Behemoth, Hello Space Boy. I'm Randall Liberon, and this is Pop Your Culture on Cheer FM and Radio Gordo. This is the Wernher von Braun and Jack Parsons episode, Weird Characters in the Field of Rocket Science. Maybe going to get a little bit weirder with some of the background with this. In 1939, it said that Jack and wife Helen, they took an interest in the Church of Thelema in Hollywood, and it is said that in their first experience there that they saw the Gnostic Mass, and it was from there that his interest kind of blossomed. Parsons was intrigued. He'd heard of the Ordo Templi Orientis founder, Aleister Crowley, one of the most notorious figures of the 20th century, perhaps worthy of study of another episode of Pop Culture or two. It is said that the book Nox on Pax, written in 1907, was the one that really got Parsons hooked, and it was from there that the hook was in. They kept on going back, and he continued to read, and it was one of these things where Parsons is said to believe that the reality of thelemic magic could be explained through quantum physics. Now, if any of you have spent much time in New Age circles, there's a lot of talk of quantum levels and quantum entanglement, and they don't always mean the same thing that physicists mean, but it seems that maybe they're all coming from different sides of this weird, hard to explain coin. But it was through that he kept coming back, and they ended up returning, and eventually in 1941 Jack and Helen were initiated into the Agape Lodge. It was through this that things, like as I was saying in the last break, things got really weird. There was the sex magic that was going on, doing these ritualistic things. It's also said that perhaps, he wasn't always the best scholar when it comes to some of this. There was some issues with maybe translation, because he would do things like Parsons apparently adopted the title Frater Topan, which had a representation in Kabbalistic numerology. These were little aspects of things that he was doing on top of all the other work. Now, some of the other work that we're also talking about is there was an actual court case in which Parsons was called to the stand to recreate a scene in which a police officer was killed with a bomb, and he managed to do it. Now, this is a guy who didn't actually have that really big actual credentialed schooling behind him. This is, to put it bluntly, a ballsy character who just sheer interest managed to get him into all of these worlds. They formed a group at one point when they were testing some of their rocket technology for JPL, that they were known essentially as the suicide squad, because they were incredibly dangerous. This was also around the time that they were ostracized by Caltech scientists who were worried about the accidents and all of that kind of stuff. So it was out of that JPL, Jet Propulsion Laboratory, was founded. Parsons was still working with his friend's experiments, Foreman, who was mentioned earlier. They ended up even having a cover story on a 1940 copy of Popular Mechanics, where they talked about rockets being able to eventually go up over through the Earth's atmosphere. They even talked about making it to the moon. Pretty far out stuff. There was even a time as well when Parsons was basically investigated by the FBI because there was a friend of Parsons who was a Marxist, but his Thelemite friend, Paul Seckler, apparently used a gun owned by Parsons in a drunken car hijacking. It was one of these things which ended up causing trouble for Parsons, but he managed to make it through it. He created a company that ended up getting a large military contract, and it still seems that this guy was one of those people who was able to just use, as I've said, sheer will and determination to get what he wanted. He stayed focused on wanting to get these contracts, work with rockets. He was bold. He would do these things, and it was just an incredible time that you could do it on such bravado. I just find it really, really wild. We'll talk a little bit more about Parsons when we come back from this music break. I think this is fitting for what Parsons was maybe envisioning himself as. The band is Monster Magnet. This is Space Lord.
I've been stuffed in your pocket for the last 100 days. When I don't get my bath, I take it out on the sleighs. So grease up your baby for the ball on the hill. I'll polish them rockets now and swallow those pills and say, oh. Space Lord, mother. There's a car in the field now in a column of flame with 2 doors to choose, but only one bears your name. You've been drinking my blood, well, I've been licking your wounds. Well, I shave off the pitch now and the scope of your tune. You'll sing, oh. Space Lord, mother. From your
Black Sabbath, Into the Void, a cut off of the Master of Reality album. The lyrics of that song seem to make it fitting in this show tonight. They follow that Monster Magnet, Space Lord. I'm Randall LeBron. This is Pop Your Culture on Cheer FM and Radio Gordo. A weird, nearly rambling show, I suppose, tonight, and talking and trying to find as much that we can quickly digest about some of these really bizarre characters that were involved apparently in rocketry. Wernher von Braun, despite his Nazi affiliation, just seems like a pretty clean-cut science dude when compared to Jack Parsons, who was, among other things, a founder of JPL, Jet Propulsion Laboratory, another company called Aerojet. They were manufacturing materials for the American military at the same time that von Braun was in Germany working on things like the V-2 rocket. There was, whether they realized it or not, a sense of competition, I suppose, between the two. But Parsons had this penchant for the occult, and he ended up being ousted from his own companies when sales were happening. I mean, they were making a lot of money with government contracts, and a guy who is into sex magic didn't necessarily fit into all of that. Parsons' private life was an incredibly sordid affair, despite the fact that he and his wife Helen were both members of the OTO. His wife Helen left for a period of time, and encouraged by the promiscuous attitude of Thelema, Parsons actually started a relationship with his wife's 17-year-old sister, which in and of itself would come back to cause issues for Parsons. Not to mention that down the road, Parsons ended up befriending science fiction writer and U.S. Navy officer L. Ron Hubbard. And with the money that Parsons had been paid out when he sold his shares in the company, he bought a house nicknamed the Parsonage. He would place ads in the papers that would specifically or specify that only bohemians, artists, musicians, atheists, anarchists, or any other exotic types need apply for rooms. Any mundane soul would be unceremoniously rejected. So it was into that state of affairs that L. Ron Hubbard soon appeared. He and Parsons became quick and close friends, and things started to fall apart when Hubbard ended up having relations with Sarah. Despite the fact that they were in an open relationship as encouraged by the OTO, this made Parsons incredibly jealous, and then we were talking about this earlier in the show when Hubbard came up with his scheme to buy boats and sail them from Florida to California, and he was looking to leave with Sarah on an adventure, and then you have Parsons creating his ritual, which affected the weather and allowed them to not leave on these. It's pretty wild that he was so caught up in these seemingly conflicting worlds of rocket science and magic that he would often push down the rocketry to utilize new ways of using the occult for himself. One of the things that he did was he used occult rituals, OTO rituals, in order to essentially conjure up a new partner. It got to the point where his exploits with black magic caused concern amongst the OTO, who it really felt like, whoa, this guy's going too far. The sex magic cult started by Aleister Crowley thought Jack Parsons was going too far. You gotta say that that is a bold figure. And I suppose at this point too, it's worth maybe pointing out that it was in an accident in his shop on his own property that Jack Parsons met his premature, I suppose if we're only looking at numbers, but the amount of things that he did in his life, 37 years maybe, was quite a lot for this bizarre fellow. he died in circumstances such that people aren't entirely sure what happened. It was an explosion, we know that, but we're not really sure what caused it. Was he working on an experiment? Most signs point to yes. But given his fascination with the occult, there are many people who kind of have the theory that he was doing a ritual and he didn't protect himself as he should have, or he was just summoning things that were far too powerful for him, or the karmic balance shifted and he just needed to pay back some of the dues for all those withdrawals that he'd been making. It's hard to say, but Jack Parsons, one of the weirdest figures in modern rocket science, at least in the 20th century, contemporary of Wernher von Braun, who was a figure in the first half of this show. As I realize, even just doing this, despite the rambling, lengthy breaks here, there are many shows worth of material on Parsons. We will have to get to those. But yeah, let's do some music. Last track of the night. Fitting for the occult vibe. I was actually talking about this in last week's show when I played a good chunk of music from the band Black Mountain from the album that I played last week, because it's just such a good one. 2016's album Volume 4, or well, 4. Yeah, Volume 4 is Black Sabbath, not Black Mountain. This is Space to Bakersfield. that's it for this show for this week. Wernher von Braun, Jack Parsons, two wild figures in rocket science. So who knows what pop culture is going to be about from week to week. Well, this time around, y'all get a heads up. I think it's time to do the Mandela Effect show. What is the Mandela Effect? It's weird. And we're going to talk about it next week on Pop Culture. Until then, y'all be cool to one another. Let's throw a shout out and a big thanks to CHR-FM and Radio Gordo as well for letting this show go out on their airwaves. Till next time, be cool to one another. We'll catch you later.